Okay, hello everyone. Should I start? So I presume, okay, thank you. So let me just introduce myself with my weakest link, which is that I am very agnostic to social media. I have not used Facebook in last 10 years. I'm not there on Facebook. So I don't know how this whole thing works. So forgive me for all the bloopers which are going to come. But having said that, it's really nice to be able to interact with all of you over this platform, and with the hope that all of you are very safe amidst this lockdown, amidst this very difficult situation. Your families are safe, doing well. I really hope that globally we are able to come out of this problem successful, and so that we can enter a new and more responsible world. And that's the reason why I'm also going to talk about a topic which has some sense of collective responsibility with all of us. But before I do that, just briefly, I am a faculty member here at Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and I have been teaching here for a few years. I especially teach in the Food and Agribusiness Management program. I have a background and a training background in economics from Humboldt University in Germany. I did my PhD there, then I taught for some time at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. I'm generally interested in food and agricultural issues. I'm also the national coordinator for FABLE Consortium, which is a UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network driven body consortium of, at the moment, 21 countries, G20 plus countries, which is actually trying to look at this entire food and land use transitions in a very scientific manner, in a very collective manner, so that we can try to come together and come up with scientifically valid information in terms of where the global equilibrium will lie as we move forward up to 2030 and 2050, so that there is a sense of collective responsibility there. So this involvement with these kind of research projects and work has made me think more on these topics. So I'll share some of the experiences from there, also coupled with some of my own processes of social habituation as you go around this topic, because food is a very interesting topic. I mean, what we eat is, of course, very personal, very interesting to us, everyone. However, largely it has remained in the domain of personal choice, remained in the domain of health and nutrition. And we have dietitians, we have nutritionists, we have medical scientists who have been talking about this. Largely, if you remember, or you may not, in 1942 there was a book written by Victor Lindor titled "You Are What You Eat." So that is kind of what sums up the whole thing about how we look at food. Is basically an absorption of the food in your system which determines your health conditions, or the nutrition conditions, or the medical implications of that. However, times are changing, situations, the way it has evolved in the last century, I would say, at least the last 5 or 6 decades, make us think whether food remains a localized personal issue entirely, or is there some relation to global health and not just personal health when we are talking about food. So what we eat is, as Victor Lindor says, you are what you eat. My question is that, is the world what we all eat, or what you eat? Which means, if the implications, if the effects of what we eat, the food around us, is very local, is very personal, then there is a justification that this remains a matter of personal choice. So you may have heard on many occasions that people say that what I eat is my business. To a certain extent, of course, yes. Of course, people also say that certain articles, Article 19 or 21 of our Constitution, they preserve, or they protect our right to choice of food. Whatever we want to eat is our issue. Fine. As long as the implications are local, as long as the implications are only on personal health. However, the question we will end with probably at this talk is that assumption or that paradigm the same? Let's look at the global health and see if it has something to do with the food we eat. I have a PowerPoint with me, which I don't think I can share with you, but I'd be very happy if later on, if you want to drop me a message. I'm on LinkedIn, of course, but no other social media, or I can ask the administrators. You can write to them. I'd be very happy to share this PowerPoint. But at the moment, this is, I will have put some important data at one place, so it's just an informative piece. So if you look at the environmental and the climate effects of the food we eat, let us look at some facts. So the food system, the entire food system, if we see, and I'm picking up from only scientific reports and scientific studies from top journals. So I'm trying to be as careful as possible not to rely on quackery as much as possible. So, and because I'm also working with some very important scientists in the world in this sector, I hope that this information is updated as we go. So around 30% of the greenhouse gas emissions, I'm sure all of you are aware of the problems of climate change. 30% of greenhouse gas emissions actually come from the food sector alone. That's a huge proportion. So it's one of the largest drivers of climate change, of environmental change, what we see globally. Okay. 80 to 86% of that emissions, of that share from food system actually comes only from agricultural production. The rest 15% or so comes from fertilizer use, from processing, packaging, transport, refrigeration, other parts. So the core of it is in agricultural production, right? So 38% comes from the use, nitrogen dioxide comes from soil transformation as we do agriculture. 38%, 32% is methane, which comes out from the largest source, and the largest source of methane is actually energy production, and almost close to that 30 to 32% of methane comes from enteric fermentation, which takes place in cattle, right, which takes place in ruminant animals, which are basically our livestock sector. Then biomass burning 12%, rice production 11%, manure management another 7%. Now 80% of the new land which is required for agricultural production on the marginal aspect, that is all the new land, 80% of the new land actually comes from deforestation. So all this agricultural production has to be done mostly through deforestation. This leads to land cover change, land use change, and some calculations suggest, or in fact many calculations talk about the economic costs of this in the range of annually $750 billion. So $750 billion US is the cost of this land use change coming exclusively from agricultural production. Fine, we all need food to eat, so what's the big deal? The big deal is that 35% of this agricultural production, of the entire output which we produce, the crops which we produce, goes to whom? Not human beings. 35%, and these are very conservative estimates, it could be a bit higher, actually go only as animal feed, to feed animals. Which animals? Animals which will be to a great extent, of course, some dairy animals, but even dairy animals in the west eventually get slaughtered. All this goes to animals which get slaughtered for protein production, animal protein production. And how much of that actually comes back to humans for consumption is only 1/4. So to simplify, for every 100 calories that is fed to animals, only around 22 to 25 calories, 22 to 25% of that comes back for human consumption. Now, what kind of mathematical sense does that make? So you feed 100 calories to animals who get slaughtered and you get back 25 calories as protein. What happens to the 75 calories? A complete waste. What does it cost globally? What does it cost where animal production, livestock production happens? Havoc, right? So, specially, this is magnified. Now, if you look at the animal categories, right? So, which animals are the most impactful on this? Or let's say, which animals are the most wasteful when you feed these 100 calories? What does actually come out of it? So, it's not that all animals are same. So, if you look at base as soybean, which is plant-based protein, which is like, say, let's think of it as a base category, then per kg of protein, actually, the average CO2 emissions which come from soybean is around 48.8 carbon dioxide equivalent per kg. Okay, so let's say 48 CO2 equivalent kg is emitted from soybean production. Now, when that soybean is fed for chicken meat, it's okay, it's around 40, it emits around 40 CO2. Goes to pork, it's around another 51, CO2 equivalent. When it goes to small ruminant meat, goat, sheep, it's 189 CO2 equivalent kg, per kg of protein which we pay. When it goes to beef cattle, the factor multiplies by roughly 6 times, 291, right, kg CO2 equivalent of emissions. So for soybean, which is plant-based protein, if you eat that quantity, it only emits 48 units of CO2. Whereas for that same, when it goes to beef, it actually ends up emitting 290 CO2 units. So that's a factor of 6, and these are different. So small ruminant meats are 190, a factor of 4. Other animals are, pork, chicken meat, a little bit less, but equally impactful. Now, for how much of the average protein content per 100 gram of product which you consume, if you look at the average protein content, soybean gives 36.5 gram of average protein content per 100 gram of production, whereas beef gives only 19.4. So even in that, you see, the output ratio just inverts. Moreover, if you look at per kg of product and you look at the average CO2 per units of emission, so for soybean, if it is 17.8 per kg of a product, then it goes up and up, but the highest is beef, which is 56.6. So that is the level at which animal production is inefficient, is a very inefficient source of actually consuming protein. We will come to the issue and aspect of whether, how much of protein is actually required. In India, emissions from beef production are even multiplied by a factor of 3 to the highest factor which we looked. Very interesting. So, cattle production or any ruminant meat production in India is even more inefficient and double or triple than that of United States and Western Europe because of low feed digestibility. Our cattle have a very low ability to digest, industrial feed, poor animal husbandry conditions, and lower carcass weights, right? So in India, it is even more inefficient. Now, what is the environmental cost of this entire cycle? Scientific calculations say in the range of $2.5 to $3 trillion per year is the cost, is the environmental impact cost on the economy of this kind of a waste. So that's an important data to be looked at. Now, 2/3 of this agricultural land, which we see is for entire agriculture, is actually used for grazing or as we saw, for producing crops to be given to animals, this has effects on deforestation. But this also, what happens is you push agriculture to high conservation value land which would have, which can be preserved to actually maintain biodiversity, to maintain ecosystem services. But all of that, there are destructive effects. So on an average, 100,000, so in India we will say 1 lakh species every year are lost because of this extra, agricultural land which is required for feeding animals and for the agricultural production aspect. Now, production of animals also, this livestock production, accounts 27 to 30% of the global consumption and pollution of freshwater resources. So there is an impact on forestation, there is an impact on land use change, there is an impact on biodiversity, species loss, there is an impact on freshwater resources, and we know how important water is, right? Just because of that 75 calories per 100 gram per 100 calories, which is simply waste because of this process of transformation. Right? Now look at some of the health risks. Now I won't go into too much of details on that because, as I said, this is not a talk on health per se as it relates to food, but there are some public health issues. So very quickly, for example, the annual health bill, the health cost, which arises due to bad health coming out of poor diets or bad unhealthy diets, which is largely linked to overconsumption of red and processed meat, is $2.7 trillion, right? So a recent WHO report, for whatever suspicions we may have about WHO, but there are a battery of very qualified scientists globally who work with the WHO, and they said it's an established link that 50 grams of processed meat a day actually increases the risk of colorectal cancer by 18%. Now this is just one example, but there are a lot of studies which show the bad impacts of industrial processed meat consumption, right? Also, the industrialization of this animal production leads to widespread use of antibiotics, which are required to keep this poultry, cattle, all of them in a healthy state, because there are a lot of diseases among them, right? Now that, when it comes into the food cycle or in the resource cycle, when it seeps in, creates a lot of antibacterial resistance, right? Antimicrobial resistance. So this also leads to the rising cost of treatment, even not for just livestock, but for humans as well, those who consume that, right? So there are health risks, there are health effects of that. Now what is the problem with all of these, what we have seen so far? So I think the data is very clear, the facts are very clear in saying the environmental effects, the health effects, the resource effects, the land use effects. But there's a problem with this, a problem in our processing. What is that problem? What we call in scholarly language is psychological distance. So the impacts, there is a psychological distance of this impact. We see that, okay, so there is greenhouse gas emissions because I eat a hamburger. Fine, you cry a couple of tears, but fine, I don't care. I actually want my piece of hamburger. I'm happy, I'm enjoying the taste. Because you don't see the effects directly. You don't see the effects of deforestation. You don't see the effects. You don't even know the kind of biodiversity loss. Forget relating to that, right? Or the water, depletion which is happening because of the distance, the psychological distance from the impacts is very high. There's something also called NIMBY, which is not in my backyard. So there's a syndrome called not in my backyard syndrome, right? Which means that, well, all of this is fine as long as it doesn't happen in my backyard, as long as I am not affected by it personally. Unfortunately, very unfortunately, at the same time, very timely, the current crisis, the pandemic crisis, which is the coronavirus crisis or the COVID-19 crisis, as we know, has actually even changed that situation forever. We can't even now say it's NIMBY. It has actually helped reduce the psychological distance so much in terms of the impacts of food we eat. Now, many of us know that a potential source of this particular kind of coronavirus coming into human transmission, coming to the human world, is a dangerous interaction with wildlife. All right. So it could have been, we can never be sure about the origins of that because it's very difficult to trace, and there will be many theories in terms of actually what happened, and all of them may have shades of realities. But it's not only COVID-19. If you pick up scientific journals, if you look at the last 10, 15 or 20 years of reports, newspaper reports, you just type pandemics, you type SARS, you type, viruses, you will see there is a constant threat of new kinds of viruses coming up. Sometimes, most of the times, they get handled or managed at a very local level, at a very small level, so they remain as epidemics. They are localized. Sometimes they become a bit bigger, like SARS, H1N1, Ebola, Nipah, and then you can come up, you can trace them very easily. The contagiousness, what is the R0 or the R1 factor, is not very high, so they get managed. So somehow we have been able to escape, but not for this one, right? So it's not that it's only one virus, but there is a systematically this has been happening. This attack has been happening. Why? Because we are perilously, dangerously close to the wildlife system in ways which are not natural. Whether it came from eating a certain kind of wildlife, or certain kind of wildlife biting, or certain kind of interaction, touching, in whatever way, it's actually the food system which brings us closer to that. Not only through the land use change, which is destroying the habitats or forest land of these wild animals, for example bats, which brings them closer. So I wrote about this in a recent op-ed in Business Line a couple of days back. You may want to look at that. But also through direct consumption, direct effects, right? So wrong types of interaction. Now, one of the credible theories about how this pandemic started is very interestingly written by a Chinese Hong Kong journalist in the New York Times. I think it came sometime in February, where this person talks about the Chinese food culture or habit of Jinbu. So basically the whole concept of Chinese Jinbu is that it is better to cure a disease with food than medicine. So that is their philosophy, which on the face of it looks fine. But look at the kind of instruments they use in Jinbu. These are mostly wildlife, animal-based interventions. So, for example, some very interesting examples. Jinbu is generally concerned about filling the energy void in men, which is basically concerned with virility and sexual prowess. In women, the stress is on replacing blood. So, for example, we have an Ayurvedic system, they have the Jinbu system. Just for simplicity's sake, it's a kind of a system. It's a way of medicinal system. But it's also mostly concerned for women, which improves their beauty and fertility. And winter is considered a time when Jinbu food becomes more important because you need more energy during winter time. Now, there may be or there may not be a correlation with the fact that this entire crisis, coronavirus, COVID-19, also started during the winter, but it could have something to do with that. So, for example, some examples. So, snakes and penis, organs of bulls and horses, they are considered to be good for men as per Jinbu, Chinese Jinbu. So, they are found in many restaurants in South China. Bats, right? Bats, which actually caused all of this, is considered good for restoring eyesight. Especially their excreta, their granular fecus in the Jinbu system is considered to be sands of nocturnal shine, which means it will give you good eyesight if you eat bats. That's the belief. Gallbladders and bile harvested from live bears are good for treating jaundice. Tiger bone is considered good by them for erections, for sexual erections. palm civet, which is a kind of a cat which was also responsible for transmission purportedly of the SARS previous versions of SARS H1N1 to humans, when that palm civet, that kind of a cat, is stewed with snake meat, it is considered to cure insomnia. Wow, right? Not only that, as per the Jinbu system, when you eat an animal which is, whose blood and energy are very high, then the power is supposed to be much more multiplied. So therefore, there is a practice among certain Chinese tribes or certain Chinese population is that they chase the dogs, right? They chase the dogs. And when the dogs are really excited, they're running, then they're slaughtered. And then it's eaten, because that is supposed to give much more, have much more effect. So that's the kind of a food belief system. Now tell me, looking at the pandemic situation, looking at the health risk, looking at the environmental, agricultural degradation, all of this, is there any doubt or is there any justification to continue saying that what we eat is local and therefore it's a matter of personal choice? I don't think so. I'm asking a question. I'm not giving an answer. I'm not passing a judgment. I'm just asking that maybe it's a right time or it's high time to think that eating may be local, but the responsibility can be global. Eating can be local. The effects need not be on personal health alone, but can be on global health. And look at what has happened to us. The entire world is in a stasis. The entire world is paralyzed to an extent which probably not even the 2 world wars could do. He said everything has stand still, right? Where is it coming from? Eating habits, eating beliefs, food system, right? So maybe it's time to ask that what kind of transformations should we expect? What kind of transformations, we should go for? So what is the alternative? The alternative is looking at plant-based diets, right? So plant-based diets, what are the impacts of that? We looked at the animal-based diets. We looked at the waste of kilocalories. But what about the plant-based diets? What impacts does it have? So there is a lot of work going on in this in many circles. I'll just cite a few. So there's a work by Leslie Hook and Stephen Barnard in UN Climate Report, where they report that if you look at various diets, so for example the Mediterranean diet, which has moderate meat and rich in vegetables, then there is a greenhouse gas mitigation potential. Actually, it can lead to lowering of greenhouse gases. What is the potential of that? Close to 2.9 billion tons of CO2 equivalent per year, right? Now, if you look at a fair and frugal diet, there are 8 or 9 types of diets which are explained. I'll only pick on a few, which is limited animal source food, but which is rich in calories. Then it improves. So the mitigation potential improves, and it is something like 3.9 billion tons CO2 equivalent per year. When you go for a healthy diet which is limited sugar, meat and dairy, very limited, then the potential again improves. You go to a flexitarian diet. Now there is becoming very popular. There is flexitarian, which is once in a while you have animal protein, but most of the time you depend on plant-based protein. Then it goes to an extent of 5.1 billion tons of CO2 equivalent every year is protected, is saved, if we transition to that. Even better, if you go to a vegetarian diet, which is meat or seafood only once a month, then that goes to around 5.9. And if you go to a complete abstinence from animal source, that is also sometimes globally known as vegan food, the global potential actually goes to 7.8 or 9 billion tons of CO2 equivalent per year, right? So what is the impact of this? The annual economic gain of this transition is estimated to be $1.25 trillion by 2030, and $1.92 trillion by 2050. That's the economic gain. So forget loss. If we make this transition to plant-based diets, science, projections, they tell us, and this is, a lot of it is also coming from our consortium on which I am involved at different levels, is actually coming, going to give an economic impetus and increase. Not only that, it will lead to a reduction in public health costs of roughly $1.9 trillion a year by 2030, which means the costs of managing public health will also reduce. There is a very important report which has come out recently. I would request you to see that, which is called the EAT Lancet report. Lancet, as of many of you know, is one of the most important medical journals in the world, and EAT Forum is one of the advocacy bodies which have collaborated together, and around 36 scientists from 17 countries, led by one of my colleagues, Professor Walter Willett from the Harvard School of Public Health, came up with this report, which actually laid out a sustainable plate for the future. So what kind of food, what will be our food plate should look like for a sustainable future, for this planet to sustain? So they came up after 3 years of very rigorous work. So their conclusions are that transformation to healthy diets by 2015 will require substantial dietary shifts. So global consumption of fruits, vegetables, nuts and legumes will have to double, and consumption of foods such as red meat and sugar will have to be reduced by 50%. A diet rich in plant-based foods and with fewer animal source foods confers both improved health and environmental benefits. Right? Healthy diets consist largely of a diversity of plant-based foods, low amounts of animal source food, contain unsaturated rather than saturated fats, and limited amounts of refined grains, highly processed foods and added sugars. So basically you have to reduce the consumption of processed food, sugars, largely cut animal production. So what does the sustainable plate? This is of course a kind of a simulation, but very rigorous scientific simulation, is that whole grains, tubers, starchy vegetables, fruits, dairy foods, protein sources, only very small proportion, around 10 to 12 or 14% should come from animal sources. Rest of all sources can come from plant-based diets, and that will still ensure that everybody has a very healthy body, because these are doctors, professionals, scientists who have worked out, and calculated and showed that there will be no impact on health. In fact, we will have a healthier life, right? And at the same time, the planet will sustain, right? So what does it mean? It simply means that we have to go for alternative sources of protein, right? Which is plant-based protein, because protein is the main problem. Animal food is actually consumed for protein. Now, is it possible to substitute that with plant-based source of protein? How do you do that? What is the effect of that? So, I am sure some of you may know that, there is a big push towards lab-grown meat now, which means actually, you take stem cells from animals, live animals, you don't harm it, you culture it in a saucer, in a beaker, in a tray in the lab, and you grow meat out of that, which tastes very close and reasonable to normal slaughtered actual animal meat. And this is a costly process, but this is of course happening. So this is happening in a big way globally, and the effects of that is that for every burger you eat from an alternative plant-based source, substituting for a beef burger actually spares 30 pounds of carbon dioxide equivalent and frees up 300 square feet of land. For one burger which you substitute from actually an animal, beef or a mutton based burger to a plant based burger, actually lab grown meat. So there are, so life cycle assessments of various plant based meat products have shown that on a median, land use savings are to an extent of 93%, water savings are to an extent of 95%, and greenhouse gas emissions are to an extent of 88.5%. Not only that, it reduces the risks of fetal contamination. Also, it reduces the antibiotic resistance problems. All of this, there are several positive impacts, but we cannot forget the fact that the meat industry is highly industrialized, and it's worth, US $2 trillion a year. And the average American actually consumes 220 pounds of red meat per year, which leads to slaughter of 30 million beef cattle only in America, and only beef cattle. I'm not talking about other ruminant, pigs, sheep, goat, chicken. No, only beef cattle. 30 million or 3 crore in India, in Indian terms. 3 crore cattle are slaughtered every year just to provide that 30, 25 to 22 to 25% of that animal-based protein. Only in the US. I'm not talking about Brazil, I'm not talking about China, I'm not talking about Europe. So imagine the kind of industrialization which is there. How do you challenge that? You challenge that by counter-industrialization. How do you beat markets? You beat markets by creating new markets. This is not a fight about morality. This is not a fight about philosophy. Oh, you have to be vegetarian. We are not talking. This is not about vegetarianism. I'm not propounding vegetarianism here. I'm saying is that we have to understand that there is a value in moving towards alternative protein sources. So one of the ways is to beat the market through the market, which means there needs to be more investment, there needs to be more entrepreneurial activity around that, and it is happening. So lab grown meat is becoming very important. So there are many good companies globally, especially based in the US, Beyond Meat, Impossible Foods, Memphis Meats. In dairy you have Ripple, Melt, Daiya, Perfect Day, which are all coming from non-animal sourced drinkable meals. And then you have egg substitutes. You have the meatless ecosystem is very vibrant now. It is becoming a multi-billion-dollar industry with Prime Roots, New Wave. You can look at this. You can go to several websites. For example, there is a Good Food Institute. You can get a lot of data from that website. They're doing a lot of good work. Clara Foods. So how does it compare the supply chain? The footprint, the chain, the footprints compared to a traditional animal-based protein versus a lab-based protein. So an animal-based protein, our data says, uses 1,799 gallons of water, whereas a lab-grown meat only uses 324 gallons of water. So 1,800 gallons and 324 gallons. It emits 16 pounds of greenhouse gas emissions, an animal-based production. The lab-based production is only 3.52. Land use 260 square feet is required. Comparably, it's only 2.6 square feet which is required when you grow it in lab. The production cost, of course, is where the economics changes. So the production cost of traditional normal meat is $1.05, right? Whereas for lab grown it is $12. So it is 12 times. So now that is where the economics changes, which means that at the moment, because there is not enough demand, because it's only started, the cost of production is very high. It's a simple economics because it has not reached the scale yet. But once there is enough demand and there's enough scale, we all know from simple economics, or maybe you'll read it as you move forward, is that this may change. So when there is enough demand, the cost of production will fall, and people will be willing to pay for that, and there will be a lively market for that. So there are a lot of startups in this field who are game changers. So you can look up at that, because you see, we need more. By 2050, the world population will be $9.6 billion, 6 billion people. So we need to pep our food production to 69% to meet that demand, the calorie demand, right? But a lot of it, if it doesn't come from plant-based, just imagine the increased impact, 69% when you ramp up production capabilities, which largely 30 to 40% out of which is actually going only for annual production. You can imagine the kind of impacts. So NOR and WWF, World Wildlife Fund, recently came up with a Future 50 food report, where they came up with a series of 50 very important plant-based protein food, and you can look at that report, and they talk about beans and pulses, algae, buckwheat, all of that which we, in our traditional sense, we know about that. There are other policy-based solutions. I'll go a bit quickly here, where you can tax kind of food, where there are regenerative agriculture which you can fund, land restoration which can be done, and natural marine algae which can be produced. These are things which can be done, which are being done. However, this is the global scenario. Is there any questions so far or any comments? I can pause for a couple of 10 seconds to see if there is something, because I really don't know how the system works. So if there is something, I'd be happy to take before we move to the next part, which is actually knowing about how does it pan out in India. Now, this is all the global picture which includes India, but when we look specifically at India, what is going on? What is the problem in India? Is the problem in India over consumption of protein? Is the problem in India over consumption of meat? Not necessarily. We all know that even if a lot of India eats meat or animal based protein, it's not in any way close to a average diet of an American or a European. We know that, right? So we are not that. In fact, there is a problem of protein deficiency in India, right? But we know that as people get rich, they move towards more meat and dairy based products, but also they move towards more processed and sugary products. So Indians actually eat more, and there is a lot of data and information on that, eat more carbohydrates and less protein, and that's a problem actually. We don't eat enough protein, right? The whole problem in India is to increase protein consumption. Indian diet falls short on most of the counts except sugar, right? So there are lots of charts in front of me which I don't want to go into details, but you can look at that, right? But protein remains a problem for Indian consumers. So how do we do this? Not only that, Indians are not only deficient in macronutrients, which is one of them is protein, but also micronutrients. And based on this, if we have to achieve food security, and a lot of India is undernourished, right? We have the largest chunk of undernourished children in the world. Adjusting for disability, so disability adjusted lost years of life from micronutrient deficiencies, India is very high, which basically means deficiency of essential vitamins and minerals. Now, if you have to solve for that, going forward in the future, and this is our own calculations from our own research, what we are doing calculations for 2030, 2050, 21 countries coming together and coming at, a global equilibrium, trying to, sort out food security issues. Actually, India's livestock consumption and production is going to increase largely, right? And 10% of that greenhouse gas actually will come from that added thing. Not only that, 52% of Indians have a diet which are protein deficient. 52%. 2/3 of Indian population have zinc deficiency, and 89% are iron deficient, 85% are vitamin A deficient. So with all this protein deficiency, is it possible that what should we do? Basically, that's the question. I mean, there is no clear answer to this. We have to figure out. On the one hand, we know that there is a global health, there is a global impact of livestock production. At the same time, our own projections, our own reality suggests that we need protein, which means what? We need to ramp up, or we need to have stronger plant-based protein. But how is it going to come? Where is it going to come from, given our dietary patterns? Right. So, how do you solve this dilemma? So there is a very interesting recent work by Narasimha Rao and colleagues at the Indian Institute of Applied Systems Analysis in YASA in Vienna, where they have tried to actually answer this problem. It says that, is it possible? Is it even possible that we can have a sustainable diet? Indians can have a healthy and sustainable diets. In this entire discussion, we forget one important thing, is that traditional Indian diet were not only sustainable, but were also healthy. The problem is, when our policies drove us over the last decade, over the last century, to consume processed cereals, starch, took us away from proteins, which means a market was created where high protein leguminous crops, where coarse cereals, pulses, they was disincentivized, and the major focus came on rice, to some extent on wheat. Especially our public distribution system, our PDS policies, they give high prices. They set high prices for these crops, which are not at all nutritious. So it is not that our traditional diets are not equipped to handle protein content. In fact, if you look at Western diets and Indian diets, one major fundamental difference is that, like you have monoculture in agriculture, you have mono diets in the Western system. So when people eat, if they eat meat, they eat only one piece of meat. If they have vegetable, they boil, eat raw carrots, they eat that. Or they boil certain vegetables. If they take lentils, they take lentil soup with some bread. But no. So all of these with the Future 50 foods, and go to the several websites, look at the detailed protein content of each and every small legume, coarse cereals, pulses, dark leafy vegetables, all of that. If you look, they may have 10 to 15% protein only. But when our diets, the way we cook, actually makes it very wholesome. So you have pea, you have carrot. So pea has 10% protein, carrot has 15% protein, you have dal, which has legumes, which has 30% protein, you have coarse cereals, which is 25% protein. When you may bring all of that in a sambar or in a dal or a curry or a sabji, when you add a certain cooking mechanism which helps absorption, digestion through oleic acid, through all of the cooking mechanisms, it actually becomes very wholesome. So the net protein content is actually balanced. This is scientifically proven. So Narasimha Rao and their team, they have worked on this, and they have showed that for those who are above poverty line, actually you can transform to a sustainable, climate friendly, healthy diet without any extra cost. You don't need to relax your budget constraints. This means you don't need to do anything extra in terms of spending to actually achieve those diets, and entirely that can, a lot of it actually can come from, of course I'm talking about a little bit of dairy included, will come from non-animal based protein, right? So what is required? What are they suggesting? They're suggesting move from rice to wheat and coarse cereals, millets, finger millets, all kinds of coarse cereals, bajra, jowar, legumes, pulses, dark leafy vegetables, coconuts, all of that when combined, they have shown that they can actually alleviate deficiencies. This is a very important paper in Global Environmental Change, which is one of the top journals in the world in this field, and they have showed that, and they have taken NSSO data and showed that actually it is possible to achieve them by these simple transitions. We probably don't even need to go to lab grown meat. We have to just look at our own traditional diets. We have to diversify our diets. We have to go back, look at our own existing dietary patterns, which we are losing. For the Western world, it's a question of coming back or leaving their existing food patterns. But for the for us in Indians, it's actually the other way. We don't need to leave our traditional diet. We need to strengthen that, and it is shown scientifically and economically that it is possible to achieve that, right? So we have to move beyond staple grains, and that is probably one way we can achieve that transition. So therefore, it is not merely about good food, it's not merely about healthy diets. What I am trying to talk here is about taking responsibility of what we eat, understanding that what we eat or what is in our plate is a matter of huge responsibility. And with all the global parameters which we discussed, on top of it, we being in India, we should certainly not be pressured to think that we are losing in the protein revolution. We probably don't need alternate protein revolution to the extent that the Western world needs. Of course, there is an increasing meat consumption, And if you can have, alternative protein, plant-based meat, which substitutes that market, urban, especially urban consumer, that's absolutely fine. But we need all kinds of intervention. But a very simple way is to look at our own traditional diets, and probably it's possible to achieve those transformation. And this aspect of taking ethical responsibility of food actually came out from India and influenced many, scholars, philosophers, political scientists, politicians in the 17th and the 18th century in Europe, which actually led to what is called scientific vegetarianism, which actually spread in 1700s in Europe. So people like René Descartes, we know the Cartesian thing, for the famous scientists, mathematicians, Francis Bacon, Pierre Gassendi, they were all pioneers, thought leaders behind this. And in fact, at one point in Europe in 17th, 18th century, they had something called vegetarian doctors. And so there was a huge consciousness because of interaction of these European invaders, travelers to India, looking at, the Hindu priests, looking at the Hindu traditional systems, the Indians studying them, and, to an extent that people like John Oswald, P.B. Shelley, Voltaire acknowledged that, the Hindus' treatment of animals represents, he said, a shaming alternative to the viciousness of European imperialists. So there is a very interesting book called Bloodless Revolution by Tristram Stuart. I would encourage you to read that, which actually details this 400 years of Indian influence on European consciousness. But of course, it post-enlightenment and due to changing geopolitical situations, there were, situations where this went into kind of a backside. Also, there were a lot of political and, counter-religious forces. In fact, Malthus actually was also, Malthus, the population theorist, was also very inspired by Indian and to some extent the vegetarian Chinese side of that, and said that, if there is any hope that the world will survive, it will be because of the kind of diets which people in India have. So he said that animal agriculture provides meat for the rich and shit for the poor. This is what Malthus said, right? So now if we compare our Ayurvedic system with the traditional, Indian system of, and I'm no expert in Ayurveda, with the Chinese Jinbu system, then we can actually see, what kind of rich knowledge we have with us, which all we have to do is to not lose that. So for example, in Jinbu, they said that bats are good for restoring eyesight, right? But we know from our own so many small simple food which we eat, we have been told, right? For example, I was told once I used to eat watermelon and throw out the seeds. I don't know how true or false that is. I'm not an Ayurveda expert, but they said the watermelon seeds actually are very good for restoring eyesight. So we don't have to eat bats. I mean, look at the richness of our information, and all of that is now getting validated. Or you have to eat palm civet stewed in snake meat to cure insomnia, but we have been told that you want to have good sleep, boil warm milk of cow, maybe add a little bit of haldi, drink it before you sleep, and you will have a good sleep. You don't need to cook bats and snakes together, right? So I'm not an expert on the dietary aspect, but all I'm saying is that we have to probably realize that it's not just you are what you eat, but it is the world which is what you eat, and we have to wake up to take responsibility of that and move towards a responsible food system. And especially we being in India have an extra responsibility, and I am always charged and questioned about that when I go. Unfortunately, we Indians are on many of Indians are on an opposite path, where the West is increasingly becoming conscious of moving away from meat-based harmful diets, whereas we Indians, especially the youth, are just mad about junk meat food. So I have been a practicing vegetarian myself, and this is not about vegetarianism or at all. This is about alternative protein, but it's just a matter of fact that I don't eat any animal-based protein, or I am a vegetarian for the last almost 23 to 24 years. and ever since I was like, in my early teens, and only now I get to understand that this is a responsibility which all of us have to share very consciously, and I'm not saying, and I'm not making any value judgments on what should be one's personal habits. All I'm saying is that let us try to minimize the impacts. Let us try to work together in all the ways possible to create awareness and be leaders in this change for a sustainable and healthy planet where we can all live together, especially in these times where we are living in very scary and vulnerable times, especially in this corona, as the corona crisis has shown. So the world moving forward will not be the same, and this is a very important aspect which is going to determine the future of this planet. Thank you very much. So what am I supposed to do now? Am I supposed to log out?